want to talk about lenses now. This is key. You could divide lenses into sort of two main categories, photographic lenses. There's zoom lenses and what's called prime lenses. For those of you who own a DSLR camera, unless you've got a very, very expensive one, chances are you buy the camera and you get a free lens with it. And it's usually something like one of these. This is a Canon lens and it goes from 18 to 55 millimeters focal length.
Focal length.
Focal length refers to the angle of view that you get when you take a photograph with a given lens. Broadly speaking, the lower the number, the wider the angle. And the higher the number, the more it brings distant scenes towards you. So on this lens here, 18 millimeters is wide angle, 55 millimeters is a little bit telephoto. We'll talk about that in a minute. All cameras have got what is called a standard focal length, although you might not have a lens for it.
Camera sensor.
Virtually all digital cameras have got a rectangular sensor. If you're able to dismantle your camera and take a ruler and measure your sensor from corner to corner, that will give you the standard focal length for your camera. The standard focal length is kind of what we see with our eyes, the angle of view that we see when we're walking down the street. On what's called a cropped or a 3/4 sensor camera, which tends to be the sort of slightly less expensive DSLR cameras, for example. So if I was to set this zoom lens to about 30 millimeters, that would give us roughly the same angle of view as you would see with your own eyes. With the larger cameras, or rather the cameras with the larger sensors like this Canon here, this is what's called a full frame sensor, the angle of view that you get actually changes a little bit. So with this camera, the standard focal length is 50 millimeters. Again, it's the corner to corner measurement of your sensor. Angle of view, wide angle, basically means anything where you can see more left and right and up and down than you can with a standard focal length. And wide angle basically makes things look a bit further away.
Zoom versus telephoto.
You heard me mention telephoto before. Now this is what some people call zoom, but it's not really the same thing. If you increase the focal length of the camera, if I twist this round to 55 millimeters on a sort of one of these crop sensor cameras, that will be roughly equivalent of 2 times magnification. It makes distant things a little bit closer, not by very much on this lens. Anything greater than the standard focal length is what's referred to as telephoto. That's when it's bringing distant things closer to you, not zoom, strictly speaking. Think of telescope, telephoto, it's the same thing. You look through a telescope to bring distant objects closer to you. You use a telephoto lens to photograph things that are further away. Okay?
Arr, matey.
Zoom lenses are variable focal length. You can change the angle of view and you can change how close things are to you or how far away they are. It's like having lots of lenses built into one, which is great. It's very convenient. Going back to the cameras that you might own yourself, if you bought a camera and it came with a sort of, one of these lenses, an 18 to 55 millimeter, this is sometimes referred to as a kit lens. These lenses are built down to a budget. They usually kind of feel a bit sort of plasticky and, a bit insubstantial. And optically, they are not brilliant. They don't tend to give you particularly sharp resolution. So I'm not saying zoom lenses are bad, I'm just saying the kit zoom lenses aren't the best.
Prime lenses, fixed lens.
And this is the other type of lens, fixed focal length. You can't zoom with this. You can't make things closer or further away using the lens. What you can't do is zoom. That means that you're going to need to, what they sometimes call zoom with your feet, where you physically got to move closer or further away from things to get the composition that you want. It's obviously a bit limiting just having one focal length, but there are advantages. First advantage is size. That's quite a big prime lens, but it's a hell of a lot smaller than the zoom lens. This one here is a slightly wide angle, it's 35 millimeter, quite good for street photography and stuff like that. The prime lens, you don't need all those moving bits. Well, you need an autofocus, but other than that, you don't need all sort of moving components. So there's less glass in this. Less glass means less scatter, less achromatic aberration, all the stuff that makes your image softer. So you tend to get a slightly sharper image. The aperture allows you to vary the amount of light coming through the lens to get the exposure right in the camera. This lens here, even though it's a zoom, it's quite a nice zoom. The maximum aperture on this is f4. The maximum aperture on this 35mm lens I've got here is, I think, f1.8. So that's more than twice the amount of light coming through this lens. That's very useful for photographing in poor light. It means you don't need flash and you can keep the ISO fairly low.